Chapter 1. Ghost of a Life. Brian Caldwell woke up at 5:30 a.m., like he had every weekday for the past 19 years. The alarm didn't jolt him anymore. It was just a sound marking the start of another day that would look exactly like the one before. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet finding the worn slippers without looking. The slippers were older than some of his coworkers' kids, but they still worked. Why replace something that wasn't broken? That was Brian's philosophy on slippers, appliances, and, apparently, his entire life. The house was silent, as it always was. No voices, no laughter, no chaos of family mornings, just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. He padded into the kitchen, flicked on the coffee maker, and stared at the dark window above. The sink. Outside. The world was still gray, the kind of early spring morning that promised warmth later, but offered nothing now. Brian didn't mind. He liked the quiet. It was predictable. Safe. Predictable didn't stab you in the back. The coffee dripped slowly, and he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes unfocused. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just letting the minutes pass until the mug was full. That was how most of his life worked now, one small task after another, strung together like beads on a thread. Wake up, coffee, shower, work, home, dinner, sleep, repeat. If life was a necklace, his was the kind you bought at a gas station. Functional, unremarkable, and guaranteed not to impress anyone. When the coffee was ready, he poured it into a plain white mug and sat at the kitchen table. The chair across from him was empty, like it had been for almost 2 decades. He didn't notice anymore. Or maybe he noticed too much. Hard to tell. He took a sip and winced. Too hot. He blew on it, watching the steam curl upward like it had somewhere better to be. On the wall behind him hung a calendar with scenic landscapes, mountains, lakes, forests. He bought the same kind every year. It was easier than thinking about what else to put there. The current month showed a meadow of wildflowers under a blue sky. He hadn't been to a meadow in years. He hadn't been anywhere in years. The last time he saw wildflowers, Kathy was still calling him Dad. He shoved that thought away like he always did. No sense digging up graves before breakfast. Brian sipped his coffee slowly, scrolling through the news on his phone. Headlines about politics, celebrity scandals, and sports scores blurred together. None of it mattered. He wasn't angry about the state of the world like some guys his age. He wasn't bitter. He was neutral. A man who had burned out every emotion until only quiet remained. He read an article about a billionaire buying a yacht the size of a football field and thought, good for him. Hope he doesn't hit an iceberg. That was about as much passion as he could muster. At 6:15, he showered, dressed in his usual work uniform, dark jeans, gray polo, steel-toe boots, and grabbed his lunch from the fridge. Ham sandwich, apple, bag of chips. Same as yesterday. Same as last week. He'd once tried turkey, but it felt like cheating on ham. He locked the door behind him and stepped into the cool morning air. The drive to the textile factory took 15 minutes. He liked that about his job. Close enough to avoid traffic, far enough that he didn't feel trapped. The factory loomed ahead, a squat building of faded brick and metal siding. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. More importantly, it didn't ask questions. Machines didn't care about your past. Fabric didn't judge. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cotton and machine oil. Brian nodded to a few coworkers as he made his way to the quality inspection station. They nodded back. Friendly enough, but not too friendly. Perfect. He didn't need anyone asking about his weekend plans. His weekend plans involved laundry and pretending to care about documentaries. Morning, Brian, said Carl, a burly guy with a permanent grin. He was tightening bolts on a loom. Morning, Brian replied, setting down his lunchbox. That was the extent of their conversation. Carl liked to talk, but he'd learned over the years that Brian didn't. Not much, anyway. Brian wasn't rude. He just didn't see the point in discussing the weather when they were both standing in it. Brian spent the next few hours checking fabric rolls for defects. It was meticulous work, measuring, examining, marking flaws, but he liked that. It gave him something to focus on, something that didn't involve feelings or memories. A wrinkle in cotton was easier to fix than a wrinkle in your soul. Around noon, he ate his lunch in the break room. A few guys joked about last night's game, laughing loud enough to fill the space. Brian listened without joining in. He didn't mind their laughter. It was nice, in a distant way, like hearing music from another room. He smiled once, when someone made a joke about a referee needing glasses. It wasn't a big smile, just enough to remind his face it still knew how. After lunch, more inspections. More quiet. More routine. At 4:30, he clocked out and drove home, the same route as always. The same houses, the same trees, the same gas station on the corner. He could have driven it blind. Sometimes he wondered if he did. His house greeted him like an old dog, familiar, a little worn, but loyal. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, small yard. He'd kept it neat over the years. Not spotless, but orderly. Predictable. He liked predictable. Predictable didn't leave you for someone with a better car. Inside, he hung his jacket, kicked off his boots, and turned on the TV for background noise. Some sitcom rerun played, laugh track echoing through the empty room. He didn't watch, not really. It was just better than silence. Silence had teeth. Dinner was simple, leftover pasta from last night. He ate at the same table where he'd had his coffee that morning. Same chair. Same view of the calendar meadow. He didn't think about the years when this table had been full, Jenny laughing, Kathy chattering about school. He didn't think about the night it all ended. He'd trained himself not to. Thinking was a luxury he couldn't afford. After dinner, he washed the dishes, wiped the counters, and settled into his recliner with a book. History mostly. Wars, empires, revolutions. Stories about people who had fought and lost, and kept going anyway. He liked those stories. They made sense to him. People betrayed each other in history too, but at least they wrote it down so you could understand why. At 9, he turned off the lights and went to bed. Another day done. Another bead on the thread. Brian's life wasn't sad, not exactly. It was hollow, like a house stripped of furniture, still standing, still functional, but echoing with every step. He'd gotten used to the echoes. Sometimes he even preferred them. Echoes didn't lie. People tried to fill the silence for him. His mom called every Sunday, cheerful and worried all at once. His sister sent texts with pictures of her kids, urging him to visit. He answered politely, but never committed. They didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't lived through the kind of betrayal that burned trust down to ash. Brian wasn't angry at Jenny anymore. Or Kathy. Not in the way people expected. The rage had burned out years ago, leaving something colder. Resignation. Acceptance. He'd built his life around being a husband and father, and when that life collapsed, he'd learned the hardest truth. Love wasn't a guarantee. It was a gamble, and he'd lost everything on the first hand. So he stopped playing. On the night of his 52nd birthday, Brian sat alone at the kitchen table with a cupcake and a single candle. He didn't make a wish for himself. He never did. He made the same wish he'd made every year since Kathy turned 15. I hope she's happy. Then he blew out the candle, washed the plate, and went to bed. Tomorrow would be the same. And that was fine. Predictable was safe. Predictable didn't hurt. What Brian didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the thread of his life was about to snag. And when it did, everything he'd spent 19 years protecting would unravel. Chapter 2. The knock at the door. Saturday mornings were sacred to Brian Caldwell. Not because they were exciting, far from it, but because they were predictable. He woke up later than usual, around 7, brewed his coffee, and sat on the porch with a paperback and the quiet hum of the neighborhood. No alarms, no deadlines, no one asking him for anything. Just him, the book, and the occasional squirrel performing acrobatics on the power lines. That morning was no different. The sun was climbing lazily over the rooftops, painting everything in soft gold. Brian had his coffee in one hand and a dog-eared copy of The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire in the other. He liked Rome. Empires fell for reasons you could chart and analyze. People fell apart for reasons that made no sense at all. He was halfway through a paragraph about Julius Caesar when the knock came. It wasn't a polite knock. It was urgent, 3 sharp raps that made the wood vibrate. Brian frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never expected anyone. His life was a fortress of solitude, and unannounced visitors were siege weapons. He set the book down, stood slowly, and walked to the door. Another knock, louder this time. Whoever it was, they weren't giving up. He opened the door, ready to tell a delivery guy he had the wrong house. It wasn't a delivery guy. It was Jenny. And Kathy. Brian froze. For a second, his brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Jenny looked older, of course. Lines around her mouth, hair streaked with gray, but the smile was the same. That smile that used to mean home and now meant nothing. Kathy stood beside her, taller than he remembered, her hair pulled back, eyes wide like she was bracing for impact. And then there was the kid, a little boy clinging to Kathy's leg, peeking out with big, curious eyes. Brian's stomach dropped so hard he thought he might throw up. Jenny spoke first. "Hi, Brian." Her voice was like a ghost, familiar and foreign all at once. It hit him like a punch to the chest. He gripped the edge of the doorframe to steady himself. "What?" His throat felt dry. "What are you doing here?" Jenny opened her mouth, but Brian didn't wait for the answer. He slammed the door so hard the walls rattled. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at the wood grain like it had betrayed him. His heart was pounding, his hands shaking. He hadn't felt this kind of raw, electric anger in years. It was like someone had ripped the lid off a box he'd buried deep underground. Another knock. Softer this time. Then Kathy's voice, muffled through the door. "Dad." Brian's body went rigid. The word was a blade, sharp and cruel. He yanked the door open so fast Kathy flinched. "Don't," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't call me that." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jenny stepped forward, hands raised like she was approaching a wild animal. "Brian, please. We just want to talk." "Talk." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that startled even him. 19 years, Jenny. 19 years of nothing. And now you want to talk? Jenny's face crumpled. Kathy looked like she might cry. The kid clung tighter to her leg, sensing the storm. Brian shook his head, stepped back, and slammed the door again. This time he locked it. He didn't go back to the porch. He didn't go back to his book. He went to the kitchen, grabbed the bottle of vodka from the cabinet, and poured a glass. No ice. No mixer. Just clear, burning oblivion. He sat in the dark living room, the glass sweating in his hand, and stared at nothing. His mind was a hurricane, memories whipping around like debris. Jenny laughing in their old kitchen. Kathy running through the yard with a soccer ball. The night Jenny told him she was leaving. The way Kathy looked at him when she said he wasn't good enough. He drank. The vodka scorched his throat, but he welcomed the pain. It was honest. It didn't lie. At some point, he got up, stumbled to the closet, and pulled out the old box of photographs. He hadn't touched it in years. It was covered in dust, like a relic from a forgotten civilization. He carried it to the coffee table, sat down, and opened the lid. There they were, smiling faces frozen in time. Jenny with her arm around him at the beach. Kathy blowing out candles on her 10th birthday. Family vacations, Christmas mornings, ordinary Tuesdays. All of it felt like someone else's life. Brian stared at the pictures until his vision blurred. Then he started tearing them up, one by one, methodical, like he was performing surgery. When the pile of scraps grew too big, he grabbed a lighter and burned them in an old metal tray. The flames flickered, devouring the past, turning it to ash. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, carrying ghosts with it. By the time he passed out on the couch, the tray was full of gray dust, and the bottle was half empty. The next few days were hell. Jenny and Kathy didn't give up. They showed up at his house again. They waited in the parking lot after work. Kathy tried calling him Dad, and he snapped. Yelled so loud people turned to stare. Told her he wasn't good enough, remember? Told her to leave him the hell alone before he filed a restraining order. He drove away shaking, his chest tight, his vision tunneling. He hadn't felt this kind of rage in decades. It scared him, not because he might hurt them. He wouldn't, but because it reminded him how much they'd hurt him, how much he'd buried, how much was still there. One night, after another ambush in the parking lot, Brian sat in his car gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. A man with gray at his temples, lines around his eyes, and a hollow look that hadn't gone away in 19 years. What do they want? He whispered to himself. What could they possibly want? He didn't know. He didn't care. He just wanted them gone. But deep down, so deep he hated himself for it. He felt something else. Something small and sharp and dangerous. Hope. And that terrified him more than anything. Chapter 3. The confrontation. Brian didn't agree to meet them because he wanted to. He agreed because he was tired. Tired of ambushes in parking lots. Tired of knocks on his door. Tired of feeling like prey in his own life. If one conversation could end this circus, then fine. He'd give them 15 minutes. Then they'd be gone. They chose a diner on the edge of town. Neutral ground. Brian arrived early, because of course he did. He sat in a booth by the window, nursing a black coffee and staring at the laminated menu like it held the secrets of the universe. He didn't want food. He didn't want coffee. He wanted this over. The bell above the door jingled, and there they were. Jenny, Kathy, and the kid, though the boy stayed with a babysitter this time. Brian felt his jaw tighten as they approached. Jenny smiled, like she was walking into a family reunion. Kathy looked like she was walking into a firing squad. Hi, Brian. Jenny said softly, sliding into the booth across from him. Kathy sat beside her, hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. Brian didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just stared at them, his face carved from stone. Jenny cleared her throat. Thank you for meeting us. Brian took a slow sip of coffee. You've got 15 minutes. Kathy flinched at the coldness in his voice. Jenny nodded, trying to keep her composure. We wanted to explain. Brian laughed. A short, sharp sound that made the waitress glance over nervously. Explain? 19 years, Jenny. 19 years of silence. And now you want to explain? Jenny's eyes glistened. I know we hurt you, hurt me. Brian leaned forward, his voice low but lethal. You didn't hurt me, Jenny. You destroyed me. You burned my life to the ground and danced in the ashes. Kathy swallowed hard. Dad. Brian's hand slammed against the table, making the silverware jump. Don't. Call me that. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. Brian's laugh was bitter enough to curdle milk. You think sorry fixes 19 years? You think it gives me back birthdays, holidays, the sound of your voice when you were 14? You think it erases the day you told me I wasn't good enough? Kathy's lips trembled. I was a kid. You were old enough to know what you were saying, Brian snapped. Old enough to look me in the eye and tell me your mom's boyfriend was better in every way. Old enough to ask me to let him adopt you. Jenny reached for his hand. He pulled back like her touch was fire. Brian, please, she whispered. I made mistakes. His voice rose, drawing stares from nearby tables. Cheating on me for God knows how long? Telling our daughter I wasn't worth loving? That's not a mistake, Jenny. That's a demolition job. Jenny's tears spilled over. Kathy was crying now too, silent and shaking. Brian didn't soften. He couldn't. The dam had broken, and 19 years of silence came roaring out. You want to know what happened after you left? He said, his voice trembling with fury. I'll tell you. I went home to an empty house and realized my entire life was a lie. I signed those papers because you said it was best for her. Best for her. And then I spent 19 years alone. No friends, no family, no one. Because I was too damn scared to trust anyone again. Jenny covered her mouth, sobbing. Kathy whispered, I didn't know. No, Brian said, his voice flat now, deadly calm. You didn't care. Not then. Not for 19 years. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. He tossed it on the table. Adoption papers. Kathy stared at them like they were a snake. You see that? Brian said. That's proof. You wanted him to be your dad. You got what you wanted. Kathy's tears blurred the words on the page. I was wrong, she whispered. I was stupid. Brian stood, towering over them. For the first time in their lives, they saw him angry. Truly angry. His voice shook the air. You don't get to rewrite history because it's inconvenient now, he said. You made your choice. Both of you. And I lived with it. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave me alone. You're going to stop showing up at my house. Stop waiting in parking lots. Stop pretending we're a family. Because we're not. Not anymore. Jenny sobbed into her hands. Kathy reached for him, desperate. Please. Brian stepped back. No. You had 19 years to say please. You didn't. Now it's too late. He turned and walked out, leaving them in a puddle of tears and regret. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. Brian sucked in a breath like he'd been drowning. His hands were shaking so hard, he could barely unlock his truck. He climbed in, gripped the steering wheel, and sat there, trembling. He wasn't proud of what he'd said. He wasn't ashamed either. He felt empty, like he'd poured out everything inside him and there was nothing left. As he drove home, the anger ebbed, replaced by something worse, exhaustion. He'd spent 19 years building walls, and in 15 minutes, Jenny and Kathy had smashed through them like they were made of paper. He hated them for that. He hated himself more. That night, Brian sat in his recliner, staring at the dark. No TV, no book, just silence. He thought about Kathy's face when he told her not to call him dad. He thought about Jenny's tears. He thought about the little boy who hadn't asked for any of this. And for the first time in years, Brian wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as finished with life as he thought. Chapter 4. The grandson. Brian didn't plan to see the boy. He didn't plan to see Kathy again either. But life, as he'd learned the hard way, didn't give a damn about plans. It started with a phone call from his father. That alone was unusual. His dad wasn't the calling type. He was the show up with a wrench and fix your sink type. So when Brian saw dad on the screen, he answered, bracing for bad news. Son, his father said, voice steady but carrying that weight Brian recognized. Kathy came by. Brian closed his eyes. Of course she did. She brought the boy. Brian said nothing. He could hear the faint sound of a child laughing in the background. It was like a ghost tapping on the walls of his mind. Brian, his father continued, I'm not telling you what to do. But he's a good kid. Doesn't know anything about what happened. Doesn't deserve to pay for it. Brian gripped the phone tighter. Dad, I'm just saying, his father cut in gently. You've spent 19 years punishing yourself. Don't punish him too. Brian hung up without answering. He sat in his recliner for a long time, staring at the wall, the silence pressing down like a weight. He didn't know Kathy anything. He didn't know Jenny anything. But the boy hadn't asked for any of this. And that was the problem. 2 days later, Brian found himself standing on his porch, watching Kathy's car pull into the driveway. He hated himself for agreeing. He hated the knot in his stomach even more. The car door opened, and there he was, a little boy with a mop of dark hair and eyes too big for his face. He clutched a stuffed dinosaur like it was a life raft. Kathy followed, nervous, her smile trembling at the edges. Brian, she said softly. This is Lucas. Lucas stared up at him, wide-eyed. Like Brian was a mountain he wasn't sure how to climb. Brian cleared his throat. Hi. Lucas blinked. Hi. That was it. No hugs, no smiles, no hallmark moment. Just 2 syllables hanging in the air like awkward laundry. Come in, Brian said finally, stepping aside. Kathy ushered Lucas inside, her eyes darting around like she expected Brian to have booby-trapped the place. He hadn't. The house was neat, quiet, and smelled faintly of coffee and solitude. Lucas wandered to the living room, clutching his dinosaur. He looked at the recliner, the bookshelf, the muted TV screen. Then he turned to Brian. Do you have Wi-Fi? Brian blinked. Yeah. Lucas nodded solemnly, like that was the most important question in the universe. Good. Brian almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he said, you want something to drink? Do you have juice? Lucas asked. Brian glanced at Kathy, who gave a helpless shrug. Apple juice, she said. If you have it. Brian didn't. He had coffee, water, and a bottle of vodka he wasn't about to offer a 4-year-old. He opened the fridge, scanned the shelves, and grabbed a can of root beer. Close enough, he muttered, handing it to Lucas. Lucas took it like a prize. Thanks. Brian watched him pop the tab with surprising skill and take a long sip. The kid was confident, comfortable, nothing like Brian felt. They sat in the living room, Brian in his recliner, Kathy on the edge of the couch, Lucas cross-legged on the floor with his dinosaur. The silence stretched, awkward and heavy. So, Kathy began, her voice tentative, Lucas likes dinosaurs. Brian nodded. I can see that. Lucas held up the toy. This is Rexy. He's a T-Rex. He eats meat. Brian stared at the plastic dinosaur. Good to know. Lucas frowned. Do you like dinosaurs? Brian hesitated. They're fine. Lucas looked scandalized. Just fine? Dinosaurs are awesome. They're like giant lizards that could eat you in one bite. Brian raised an eyebrow. Sounds like a bad pet. Lucas giggled, a bright, bubbling sound that hit Brian like sunlight through clouds. He didn't smile, not fully, but something in his chest loosened. The visit lasted an hour. Kathy tried to make conversation, but Brian kept his answers short. He wasn't ready for her words. He wasn't ready for her eyes, full of regret and hope. But Lucas was easy. Lucas didn't want apologies or explanations. He wanted to show Brian how Rexy could defeat a Stegosaurus in an epic battle on the living room rug. When they left, Lucas waved from the car window. Bye, Brian. Brian stood on the porch, watching them drive away, the echo of that cheerful voice lingering in the air. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness. Not forgiveness. Something smaller. Something dangerous. A crack in the armor. That night, Brian sat at the kitchen table, staring at the calendar meadow. He thought about Lucas's laugh, about the way the boy's eyes lit up when he talked about dinosaurs, about how easy it was to be around someone who didn't know the wreckage behind him. He hated it. He hated how much he wanted more, because wanting more meant risking everything. And Brian Caldwell didn't gamble anymore. But life had other plans. 2 weeks later, Lucas was back, this time with crayons and a stack of paper. He spread them across Brian's coffee table like he owned the place. "What are you doing?" Brian asked, watching him from the recliner. "Drawing dinosaurs," Lucas said matter-of-factly. "You can help." Brian blinked. "I don't draw." Lucas shrugged. "You can try." Brian stared at the crayons. He hadn't held one since Kathy was little. His fingers felt clumsy as he picked up a green crayon and started sketching something vaguely reptilian. Lucas peered at it. "That's okay." Brian snorted. "Thanks." Lucas grinned. "You're better than mommy." Brian glanced at Kathy, who was sitting quietly on the couch, watching them with eyes that looked like they might break. He looked away. By the time they left, the coffee table was covered in dinosaurs, some decent, some disasters. Lucas hugged his stack of drawings like treasure. "Bye, Brian," he chirped again, waving as the car pulled out. Brian stood in the doorway, a green crayon still in his hand, and wondered what the hell was happening to his life. Chapter 5. A New Kind of Love. Brian Caldwell didn't believe in turning points. Life wasn't a movie. There were no sweeping crescendos, no dramatic epiphanies. Just days stacked on days, like bricks in a wall. But if he had to pick a moment when something shifted, something small, something dangerous, it was the Saturday Lucas showed up with a soccer ball. Brian opened the door expecting crayons and dinosaurs. Instead, Lucas stood there grinning, ball tucked under his arm like a secret mission. "Hi, Brian," he chirped. "Can we play?" Brian blinked. "Play? Soccer?" Lucas bounced on his toes. "Mom said you used to play." Brian shot Kathy a look. She shrugged, sheepish. "You did," she said softly. Back when life didn't feel like a locked room. Back when he had a yard full of laughter and a heart full of trust. Back when Kathy was 8 and thought he hung the moon." Brian cleared his throat. "I haven't played in years." Lucas grinned wider. "That's okay. I'll teach you." Brian almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he stepped aside. "Fine. 10 minutes." The yard was small, patchy grass and a leaning fence, but Lucas didn't care. He set the ball down, eyes bright, and kicked it toward Brian with all the force his little legs could muster. It rolled 3 feet and stopped. Brian stared at it. "Wow. Terrifying." Lucas giggled. "Kick it back." Brian nudged the ball with his boot. Lucas chased it like it was the World Cup. His laughter rang out, high and clear, slicing through the quiet that had wrapped around Brian's house for 19 years. Something in Brian's chest cracked. He didn't notice the neighbor until she spoke. "Looks like you've got competition for the big leagues." Brian turned. A woman stood by the fence, leaning casually against the post. Mid-40s, maybe. Dark hair pulled into a ponytail, jeans, and a faded t-shirt. She had a smile that could melt steel and eyes that sparkled like she knew every joke in the world. Brian stiffened. Hi." She nodded toward Lucas. "He's got a good kick." Lucas beamed. "I'm teaching Brian soccer." The woman laughed. "Good luck with that." Brian felt heat creep up his neck. He wasn't used to strangers, especially ones who smiled like that. "He's persistent," he said, voice awkward. "I'm Megan," she offered, resting her arms on the fence. "Live next door?" "Been meaning to say hello." Brian nodded, words sticking in his throat. He wasn't good at hello. Hello led to conversations. Conversations led to trust. Trust led to ruin. Lucas saved him. "Brian drew dinosaurs with me last time," he announced proudly. Megan's eyebrows lifted. "Dinosaurs? Impressive," Brian muttered. "They looked like lizards with identity crises." Megan laughed, a warm, easy sound that made Brian's stomach twist in a way he hadn't felt in decades. He hated it. He hated how much he didn't hate it. After Megan wandered back to her yard, Brian felt off balance. He told himself it was nothing, just a neighbor being polite. But her laugh lingered in his head like a song he couldn't shake. Lucas didn't notice. He was too busy scoring imaginary goals and declaring himself champion of the universe. When Kathy finally called time, Brian was sweating, his legs aching, and his heart doing something strange, something he didn't trust. That night, Brian sat in his recliner, staring at the wall. He thought about Lucas's grin, about Megan's laugh, about the way Kathy had watched him, hope flickering in her eyes like a candle in the wind. He hated hope. Hope was a liar. Hope was a con artist with a winning smile. He'd fallen for it once. He wouldn't fall again. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Lucas holding up that soccer ball like a trophy. And for the first time in 19 years, Brian wondered if maybe, just maybe, life wasn't done with him yet. The visits became routine. Saturdays with Lucas. Sometimes crayons, sometimes soccer, sometimes building Lego towers that collapsed spectacularly. Brian found himself laughing, quietly, reluctantly, but laughing. It felt strange, like using muscles that had atrophied. Kathy stayed in the background, careful not to push. She brought coffee, made small talk, tried not to cry when Brian kept his answers short. He wasn't ready for her. Maybe he never would be. But Lucas was easy. One afternoon, Lucas asked, "Brian, do you have kids?" Brian froze. The question was a knife wrapped in innocence. "No," he said finally, voice flat. "I don't." Lucas frowned. "But Mom said," Lucas. Kathy cut in quickly, her voice tight. "Go draw Rexy." Lucas scampered off, oblivious. Brian stared at Kathy, anger simmering under the surface. Don't, he said quietly. Don't tell him stories. Kathy's eyes filled with tears. I wasn't. Brian stood, ending it before it began. Just don't. Later, when the house was empty again, Brian sat in the dark, the silence pressing down like a weight. He thought about Lucas's question, about Kathy's face, about the truth he couldn't escape. He didn't have kids. Not anymore. He had a boy who liked dinosaurs and soccer and thought Brian was someone worth teaching. And that scared him more than anything. The romantic subplot slipped in quietly, like sunlight through blinds. Megan started waving when Brian was outside. Sometimes she stopped to chat, about the weather, about her garden, about Lucas's soccer skills. Brian kept his guard up, but Megan had a way of disarming him without trying. One evening, she leaned over the fence, holding a plate of cookies. Made too many, she said with a grin. Thought you might help. Brian stared at the plate like it was a live grenade. Thanks. She laughed. You always this enthusiastic? Brian almost smiled. Almost. I'm not great at small talk. Good thing I'm great at it, she said, eyes twinkling. Balance right. Brian took the cookies, muttered a thank you, and retreated inside like a man escaping enemy territory. But later, when he bit into one, he realized something unsettling. They tasted like hope. Chapter 6. Trust and Consequences. Trust was a four-letter word in Brian Caldwell's dictionary. Not literally, but close enough. It was sharp, dangerous, and best avoided. He'd spent 19 years building a life where trust wasn't required. Machines didn't betray you, books didn't cheat, solitude didn't lie. And now, thanks to a 4-year-old with a stuffed dinosaur, cracks were forming in the walls he'd sworn would never fall. Lucas had been visiting for weeks now. Not every day, Brian would never allow that, but enough that the house didn't feel quite as silent anymore. The boy had a way of filling space without demanding too much. He'd chatter about dinosaurs, cartoons, and why broccoli was evil, then curl up on the rug with his crayons like he owned the place. Brian didn't mind. Against his better judgment, he almost looked forward to it. Almost. Because every time Lucas laughed, every time those big eyes lit up, Brian felt the same fear gnawing at his gut. What happens when this ends? What happens when Kathy decides it's too hard, or Jenny interferes, or life does what life always does? Rips away the one thing that makes you feel alive. Brian didn't gamble anymore, and letting Lucas in felt like betting the house. Kathy noticed the change before Brian did. She saw it in the way he crouched on the floor to help Lucas build a Lego fortress, pretending he wasn't enjoying himself. She saw it in the way his voice softened when he asked Lucas if Rexy had beaten the Stegosaurus yet. It gave her hope, a fragile, flickering thing, but hope nonetheless. One afternoon, after Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch mid-cartoon marathon, Kathy ventured into dangerous territory. Brian, she said quietly, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. Thank you. He didn't look up from his coffee. For what? For letting him in. Brian's jaw tightened. I didn't let him in. He walked in. Kathy smiled faintly. You could have slammed the door. Brian's eyes flicked to hers, cold and sharp. Don't push it. She swallowed hard. I'm not. I know I don't deserve this. Any of it. Brian set the mug down with a soft thud. You're right. You don't. The words hit like a slap, but Kathy didn't flinch. She'd expected worse. I was a kid, she whispered. I didn't understand. You understood enough to tell me I wasn't good enough. Brian cut in, his voice low and lethal. You understood enough to ask me to let someone else be your father. Kathy's eyes brimmed with tears. I regret it every day. Brian leaned back, arms crossed. Regret doesn't give me 19 years back. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Kathy stared at the table, her throat tight. Brian stared at the wall, his face carved from stone. Finally, Kathy spoke. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you not to punish him. Brian's gaze snapped to hers. I would never punish him. Then, maybe punish me less, she whispered. Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the truth was, he didn't know how. That night, after they left, Brian sat in his recliner, staring at the dark. Kathy's words echoed in his head like a stubborn song lyric. Punish me less. He didn't want to punish her. He didn't want to feel anything at all. But feelings had a way of creeping in when you weren't looking. He thought about Lucas, his laugh, his crayons, the way he'd asked if Brian liked dinosaurs. He thought about Kathy, her tears, her voice trembling with something that sounded like truth. And for the first time in years, Brian wondered if maybe trust wasn't a 4-letter word after all. Maybe it was a 5-letter word. Risk. The next day, Brian went to the diner for lunch. He didn't usually eat out, too many people, too much small talk, but he needed space. He needed noise that wasn't coming from inside his own head. He slid into a booth, ordered a burger, and stared out the window. That's when he saw her. Not Kathy. Not Jenny. Her. She was sitting at the counter, laughing with the waitress, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, a smudge of flour on her cheek, like she'd wrestled a bag of it and lost. She looked normal, warm, alive in a way Brian hadn't felt in decades. He didn't stare. He wasn't that guy. But when she glanced his way and smiled, a quick, easy smile that didn't ask for anything, something in his chest shifted. The waitress brought his burger. Brian ate in silence, pretending he wasn't aware of the woman at the counter. But when she stood to leave, their eyes met again. She smiled once more, then walked out, the bell above the door jingling like a punctuation mark. Brian sat there, chewing slowly, wondering what the hell just happened. That night, Kathy called. Not to beg, not to cry, just to ask if Lucas could come by tomorrow. Brian said yes before he could stop himself. After he hung up, he stared at the phone, the memory of that smile lingering like a ghost. Trust was dangerous. He knew that. But for the first time in 19 years, Brian felt something stronger than fear. Curiosity. The next day, Lucas arrived armed with questions. Brian, he said, plopping onto the rug with his crayons. Do you have a girlfriend? Brian choked on his coffee. What? Lucas looked up, dead serious. Mom says you're single. That means you need a girlfriend. Brian blinked. Pretty sure that's not how it works. Lucas shrugged. You could marry Mom again. Brian laughed. A short, sharp sound that startled even him. Not happening, kid. Lucas frowned. Why not? Because, Brian said, leaning back in his chair, some things break and stay broken. Lucas considered this, then nodded solemnly. Okay, but you should still get a girlfriend. You look lonely. Brian stared at him, speechless. Kathy sat on the couch, her face flaming. Lucas, she hissed, that's not. It's fine, Brian said, holding up a hand. He's not wrong. Kathy blinked. You're agreeing with him? Brian shrugged. Doesn't mean I'm taking his advice. Lucas grinned. I'll help you find one. Brian groaned. God help me. Later, after they left, Brian sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and staring at the calendar meadow. He thought about Lucas's words. He thought about the woman at the diner. He thought about trust, how it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, wind whipping at your back, knowing one wrong step could kill you. But he also thought about consequences, the kind that came from doing nothing, from staying safe, from living like a ghost until there was nothing left to haunt. Brian didn't know if he could trust again. He didn't know if he wanted to. But for the first time in 19 years, he knew one thing for sure. He was tired of consequences. Chapter 7. Something like healing. Brian Caldwell had never been good at endings. He preferred routines, things that didn't end, didn't change, didn't break. But life wasn't a factory line. It didn't run smooth forever. It jammed, it tore, it forced you to fix what you'd rather throw away. He sat on his porch that morning, coffee steaming in his hand, watching the neighborhood wake up. Kids on bikes, dogs tugging leashes, a couple arguing about mulch. Ordinary life. The kind he'd been avoiding for 19 years. Lucas was coming over later. Brian knew because Kathy had texted, polite, cautious, like she was approaching a wild animal. Lucas wants to show you his new dinosaur book. Is that okay? Brian had stared at the message for a long time before typing back, fine, fine. His favorite word. Short, neutral, impossible to argue with. But nothing about this was fine. Not the way Lucas's laugh chipped at his walls. Not the way Kathy's eyes carried 19 years of regret. Not the way Brian's own heart felt like a locked room with someone knocking on the door. When they arrived, Lucas burst in like a firework. Brian, look, he held up a glossy book with a T-Rex on the cover. This one has facts. Real facts. Brian took the book, flipping through pages filled with teeth and claws. Looks serious. Lucas nodded solemnly. Dinosaurs are serious business. Brian almost smiled. Almost. You want to read it? Lucas plopped onto the rug, already turning pages. Kathy hovered in the doorway, unsure whether to sit or vanish. Brian gestured to the couch without looking at her. She sat, hands folded tight. For the next hour, Lucas narrated dinosaur trivia like a tiny professor. Brian listened, asked questions, even corrected a pronunciation or two. It felt normal. Dangerous, but normal. When Lucas ran off to the kitchen for juice, Kathy spoke softly. He loves you. Brian's jaw tightened. He doesn't know me. He knows enough, she said. He knows you listen. Brian stared at the book in his hands. Listening's easy. Kathy's voice trembled. It wasn't easy for me. Brian looked up, his eyes cold. Don't. She swallowed hard. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for something. Brian set the book down. Something doesn't exist. Her eyes glistened. Then let me try anyway. Brian stood, needing space. You had 19 years to try. Kathy's tears spilled over. I was wrong. Brian's voice was flat. You were gone. Lucas barreled back in, breaking the tension like a wrecking ball. Brian, did you know some dinosaurs had feathers? Brian blinked. Feathers? Lucas nodded vigorously. Like chickens. But scarier. Brian chuckled. A real sound this time, rusty but alive. That's terrifying. Lucas grinned. You should draw one. Brian groaned. Not this again. Lucas shoved crayons at him anyway. Come on. Brian sat on the floor, picking up a blue crayon. Kathy watched, silent, as he sketched something vaguely bird-like with teeth. Lucas declared it awesome and taped it to the fridge like a trophy. Brian stared at the crooked drawing, something warm flickering in his chest. He hated it. He needed it. After they left, the house felt too quiet. Brian wandered to the fridge, staring at the dinosaur drawing. It looked ridiculous. It looked like hope. He poured coffee, sat at the table, and thought about consequences, the kind that came from doing nothing, from staying safe, from living like a ghost until there was nothing left to haunt. He thought about Lucas's laugh, about Kathy's tears, about the woman at the diner with flour on her cheek and a smile that didn't ask for anything. Brian didn't know if he could trust again. He didn't know if he wanted to. But he knew one thing. He was tired of being afraid. The next week, Brian went back to the diner. Same booth, same black coffee. He didn't expect to see her again. But there she was, at the counter, laughing with the waitress, hair in that same messy bun. She glanced his way, smiled, and this time, Brian smiled back. It wasn't much. Just a curve of the lips, small and cautious. But it felt like opening a window in a room that had been sealed for years. She walked past his booth on her way out. "You're here a lot," she said lightly. Brian shrugged. "I like the coffee." She grinned. "It's terrible." Brian almost laughed. "Fair point." She held out a hand. "I'm Claire." Brian hesitated, then shook it. "Brian." Her hand was warm. Her smile was warmer. And for the first time in 19 years, Brian felt something that wasn't fear. It was possibility. That night, Brian sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the rooftops. He thought about Lucas, Kathy, Claire, about trust and consequences, about how life didn't give you guarantees, just chances. He wasn't ready to forgive. He wasn't ready to fall in love. But maybe, just maybe, he was ready to stop being a ghost. Brian took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 19 years lift, just a little. Tomorrow, Lucas would come over with more dinosaur facts. Maybe Brian would draw another one. Maybe he'd go back to the diner and ask Claire about the flower on her cheek. Maybe he'd take a risk. Because some things break and stay broken. And some things, if you're brave enough, become something like healing. Epilogue. Something like healing. The house was quiet, as it always had been. But it didn't feel quite as hollow anymore. On the coffee table sat a stack of crayon drawings. Dinosaurs in every color imaginable. Some fierce, some smiling like cartoon heroes. Brian hadn't moved them. He told himself it was because he hadn't gotten around to cleaning, but the truth was simpler. He liked seeing them there. They were proof of something unexpected. Something fragile. Lucas had been by earlier, chattering about a school project and asking if Brian knew how to make a volcano erupt. Brian didn't, but he promised they'd figure it out together. The promise surprised him. 19 years ago, he'd sworn off promises. They were too dangerous, too easy to break. But this one felt safe, small enough to keep. Kathy had come too, hovering in the background like a shadow that wanted to be light. She didn't push anymore. She didn't beg. She just watched, quiet and careful, as Brian and Lucas built a Lego fortress on the living room rug. When she left, she said thank you. Not for the Legos, not for the root beer, but for something bigger. Brian didn't answer. He wasn't ready. Maybe he never would be. After they drove away, Brian stood at the window for a long time, watching the taillights fade. He felt the old ache, sharp and deep, but it didn't crush him like it used to. It was still there. Maybe it always would be, but something had shifted. The pain wasn't the whole story anymore. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table. The calendar still showed a meadow of wildflowers under a blue sky. For the first time in years, Brian wondered what it would feel like to stand in a place like that. To breathe air that smelled like earth and sunlight instead of cotton and machine oil. He didn't know if he'd ever go. He didn't know if he'd ever trust enough to let someone in. Not Kathy, not Jenny, not anyone. But he knew this. Life wasn't finished with him yet. It had cracks now, and through those cracks, something green was growing. Not forgiveness. Not love. Not yet. But hope. And for Brian Caldwell, that was enough.